Hello, fellow travelers on Life's Highway. I'm Omri, your guide on exploring Life's Highway. Today we're going to a cool journey into how culture and language are connected. I've got today two awesome guests, together with me, Andrew and Atzmon. Andrew, can you start by saying hi and telling our listeners a bit about yourself?
Of course, Omri. Hello, Atzmon. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Andrew Elrod. I am a teacher, a researcher, currently doing PhD work studying generative AI, its biases, its effect on the digital humanities. I'm a husband, a writer, a father of 3 daughters, and when you combine all of that, it results in hair loss.
Thanks, Andrew. Now, Atzmon, it's your turn. Can you say hello and share a bit about who you are?
Well, I'm Atzmon Yaniv, living in Israel. I am a law graduate of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a master's degree in law from the Bar Ilan University. I was practicing law, especially litigation, for over 40 years. I'm a poet, I'm a painter, and I like life. I'm a father of 3 sons and 6 grandchildren, which makes life so happy, of course. And I'm glad to be here on your program with Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew and Atzmon, for being part of today's episode. Now, let's dive into our topic today, the fascinating connection between culture and language. Our first question for both of you, which do you think comes first? The way people talk or the way they live and share traditions?
All right, well, I can begin if you like.
Yes, please.
The way people talk, language, the way they share life and traditions, culture, that's really a difficult question. I would say that living together and sharing life together probably comes first, but alongside that, language forms. And as language forms, we form deeper cultures, more meaningful practices and traditions, and it shapes our minds as well. So saying which comes first is really quite a difficult thing. We can't really decouple language and culture, it seems to me.
Atzmon, what do you think about that?
I tend to agree that you cannot really point out what comes first. I know, for example, that in the last decades, many languages are becoming like endangered species. They are becoming endangered languages and they are becoming extinct. And a lot of effort is being done by researchers and philologists to try and preserve those languages which are fading out. And the question is, why are they putting so much energy in preserving these languages? I believe that they want to preserve the languages because they want to preserve the culture of the people who speak it. And when these languages are extinct, the culture of the people who spoke it is also extinct. So therefore I think that that culture is actually capsulated within languages, and that's why people are putting so much effort in trying to preserve these languages which are fading away.
Now that's bring me into the second questions. Does language help us to express a culture identity, or does a culture background influence the way we use language?
I think the answer to that is yes. Yes, both and. Language, as Atzmon just told us, it carries culture. It without the language connected to our culture, we cannot maintain that culture as we understand it. Even the words that we have meanings that turn on cultural concepts, ideas, metaphors. I can think of, my studies in French or Hebrew or, extensive studies in the English language. And in each of those, there are certain things that just can't be translated. I don't even like using the word translation. It's always interpretation from one culture to another when we're dealing with language. So, yeah, in a roundabout way, it's hard to say which. It's a both and in that case every time.
Well, as I stated before, I live in Israel, and you know that Hebrew is one of the oldest spoken languages. It's at least 3,000 years old, whilst the English is the Old English, what they call, is about 1,500 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And Hebrew was spoken until the 4th century, and then people stopped speaking it. It was only being read in the scriptures, but not being spoken. And when the Jews starting coming back to the Holy Land and trying to rebuild a national home for the Jews, there was a big dispute about which language should be spoken here, because Hebrew was the extinct Old Hebrew and wasn't a spoken language for so many years. And people were afraid that we would not be able to carry all the walks and needs of life. It happens to be that my great-grandmother was one of the first people, together, of course, with Eliezer ben Yehuda, the reviver of the spoken Hebrew language, who insisted that Jews in Palestine or in the Holy Land or in Israel could not be a nation if they did not speak Hebrew. It went together, the Hebrew language with being a Jew, with living in this country. So that's why they went through a very strong struggle to return the spoken Hebrew to be the language people lived by and spoke by. And this is because I cannot see a Jew living in Israel not speaking Hebrew. It goes together. It's inseparable. So because it carries all the culture of all the generations before. So that's why I think they go side by side, and I agree with Andrew here, of course.
It seems to me too that you're describing probably the best example in history of language and culture going side by side. The language carried the traditions, and then the preservation through tradition provided a framework for the modern language to be revived out of the traditional language. That's the best historical example we could see.
Yes, it was a fantastic process. You can imagine so many things had happened in the world, and so many words were missing for daily life. But there was a whole project of finding words that derived from sources in the old Hebrew language, so it made sense. They would express the new words that had to be used. It was a whole project, but it succeeded. And now you can talk in Hebrew and say whatever you want and be understood, and there's not one word missing.
So if I ask you, what is the word for computer?
Computer,
Give
machshev.
me
what? It's called machshev, and it comes from the word machshava, which means thinking. A thought. So that's how it works. You find the source, a word that expresses the meaning, and you turn it somehow in a certain way to be relevant to what you want to describe.
So computers are thinkers.
Yes, yes.
It seems
Something.
that
It's a machine that thinks. Yes.
it seems that we've answered Alan Turing's 1950 paper, "Can computers think?"
You
And
see.
all we needed was Hebrew to do it for us.
You see.
That's fantastic, especially now. That's really a great image. I'm going to use that one.
Okay.
Uh, I think the origin of computer comes from the word lechashev, which means to calculate, not to think. But it's the
I
same.
think it comes from the word machshava, which means thinking or thought.
Yeah.
But we can have a dispute on that.
But
We won't settle it now.
I thought about it. If who we are is the way we think, and this little voice we have inside our head is come from the language we speak since the moment we born. What happens if we have 2 languages or 3 languages? I want to ask Andrew. What happens then into this little voice we have when we dreaming or thinking?
It's always been very interesting to me because, of course, I have not. I know that some people might have it differently, but in my own mind, there's always been a element of narration, and that narration is 95% of the time in English because it's what I grew up with. But it makes me think of. I don't know if he really said it. It might be one of those legends, but there's a quote by Charlemagne. The person who has 2 languages has 2 souls.
Okay.
With every language, there comes a certain tendency of thought, not just a culture, but a certain way of thinking behind it. It's almost as though the thoughts are structured by the language and vice versa. I think that when we have 2 languages, we perhaps find greater utility to express some things than others. There was a Japanese scientist, I forget what field he was in, but I will never forget what he said. He said that, talking about this very issue, he said, you know what? Here's why we're not doing a lot of our science in Japanese, because English is a great language for science, and Japanese is a great language for wisdom and poetry. He said, I can't speak to that because I don't know Japanese, but I think the point is well made that certain languages lend themselves better, perhaps, to certain types of thinking and certain forms of expression.
What do you think, Atzmon?
I do not totally agree with that. I think that English had become the language of the scientists and was used in computers, etc. And maybe this gave this Japanese scholar the feeling that it was a better language for research or for other things that you described. And it was natural that this was a language of the scientists. But had Japanese been used for science and calculations and computers, it might have been. But it's a compliment on one hand to the English language to be considered as the language of the scientists. But on the other hand, what he says is that the Japanese language preserves our Japanese nature as nature lovers, as poetry lovers, etc., etc.
But I want to dig even deeper, Atzmon, and ask you.
But if I don't remember, sometimes I dream in English and sometimes I dream in Hebrew, mostly in Hebrew, and sometimes I don't dream at all. But what I do want to say is that it's amazing that any extra language you acquire opens your mind to a new world. Like you can live when you know another language well enough to be able to read what writers wrote in this language and see things that have been created alongside with this language. you are exposed to a new world. And the more languages you are able to learn, your life becomes better in the sense that you are exposed to more and more worlds. You can live like 3 times as much as you can live when you know only one language. You see another world. So it is fantastic if you have my grandfather spoke 8 languages, and I always envied him because every language you can talk and understand opens another world for you. So you can simultaneously live in 3, 4, 5 words, as many languages as you can talk and understand.
I had
That's
read a psychological study recently that was, I don't know exactly how it was measured, but they were measuring people's the depth of their emotional experience essentially. And what they found was that the greater vocabulary one had to describe their emotions, the more deeply they felt things. And I think that's what you're describing with opening new worlds through having new languages. We have just given our minds whole new worlds of expression, whole new places and things to explore by that. And I think that gets back to Charlemagne then. The more languages we have, the more souls we have.
I agree. To that, I agree. Yes.
Yeah.
That's great perspectives. And finally, our last question is think about your own experience. How has the language you speak shaped your understanding of your cultural heritage? And how has your culture influenced the way you communicate, Andrew?
You know, that's a difficult question.
It is.
Like
But
so,
he's not. Omri is here to ask difficult questions. Go
it was a uniquely difficult question to ask an American because, like so many Americans, I lived in a very monolingual world, and it wasn't until, I mean, I learned Spanish and I could speak a little bit.
And
I went
French.
down to Mexico, practiced, but when I went to France, I had to actually learn French, communicate in French on a daily basis, and it had to become a part of my life. And that's when I started to understand what it meant to be somebody who could use more than one language. And it wasn't until that point that I understood that my own native language carried a culture with it and shaped my view of the world.
Atzmon speak a
And
bit of French, right, Atzmon?
what was that?
I speak French, yes, not
Ah, d'accord.
100%, but by the way, 28% of the words in English are derived from French origin. So
Yeah.
it's quite simple. I mean, there's so many words who are from the same in French and in English. And yes, French is another beautiful language. And I wish I could speak more languages. But if I come back to your question, as I said, I'm a poet, and I've told you previously, Andrew also, we had a discussion once, and I told you that the words I use in my poetry come from a large scape of Hebrew, a variety of words that go back to the biblical Hebrew, the Talmudic Hebrew, the older Hebrew, the period when Hebrew was not yet spoken but written in the 18th and 19th century, and the contemporary Hebrew. So, and somebody who knows the development of Hebrew from the biblical sources and before up to these days can see in my poetry the history of Hebrew, and it brings back memories and points out to the reader of words like in the Bible that have a certain meaning, that tell a certain story, and it makes the scope of my poetry so much wider because it gives the reader an ability to refer in his mind to all sorts of events that have a connection with the words I use. So this is something, this scope of language, which goes back 3,000 years back and up to these days, with all what happened to the Hebrew language, is a fantastic thing that I'm happy that I know Hebrew well enough so I can write in this beautiful language, which is so old and so new and has so many interesting things about it.
Yeah, Omri's question too made me think something like that. When you're describing your poetry, it is connected to the history of those words. And not everyone can appreciate that to the same extent that you can. It really encourages us to explore and to learn more about our own languages and thereby learn more about our own cultures. When I learned French and I started to see that 28% connection with the
Yes.
language, it really encouraged me to start exploring my own English language and the foundational stories and narratives, things like John Milton's Paradise Lost or any number of Shakespeare's works.
Mhm.
As I deepened my connection to the culture and to the language, I had a greater appreciation for both, and I saw how much I was shaped and how much my daily metaphors and expressions were shaped by that cultural milieu.
But do you feel your
And
vocabulary have an impact of your expression?
I'm sorry?
Do you feel the bigger your vocabulary is, you have more ability to express yourself?
Yes, and I find the more confused I make people. So, especially when you're teaching English, for instance, in an international context, it becomes very difficult to shift gears from the PhD researcher expressing in subtlety and very nuanced language, both scientific and literary, to downshift and then try to use sentences that you know will be understood by not just one culture that has English as its second language or as its middle language, but to five or six cultures. You have to determine which expressions are going to carry over. How many expressions at all can I use? And there is a great deal of value in that process of simplification as well, because you have to question what is unique to you and what is universal.
Interesting. And Atzmon, you can share a personal perspective, how cultural heritage influence the way you communicate?
Not in that respect that Andrew was describing, but I do agree that not everybody understands me. Not everyone understands some of it's amazing, that Hebrew has developed to such an extent that Hebrew, and you know that, Omri, that is spoken now, the slang language of Hebrew, is so far away from the biblical language. And I have a poem that I wrote about a young boy, the son of my secretary, who read one of my poems, and he read it again, and he said, "What language is this? This is not Hebrew," he said to me. Really? And
Yeah.
I wrote a poem which said, "Where did we go wrong? That our children read our Hebrew and say it is not Hebrew." So it goes as far as that. And therefore, I understand what Andrew says, the simplification and
Yeah.
how much to simplify, because on one hand, you want to remain at a certain level and degree of language that you are accustomed to and you think is appropriate to talk with students. And on the other hand, you have to make a decision, how low can you get in simplifying the language. So there is this diversity of talking high language or middle language or low language, so to speak.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm sure that you know this from experience. That low language is the hardest. to speak. It really is.
I'm not sure I can talk in this language.
It can be quite difficult, yeah.
Yes.
And, language is always in that process of evolution. I have 3 teenage daughters, and I get to observe that very fast
Yes.
evolutionary process
The TikTok
firsthand.
language is not a language I can understand sometimes. Yes, I agree.
I'm feeling that way more and more often, especially with the Oxford English Dictionary just introducing Riz as a word to the English language. We don't need to have a discussion on Riz here, but just as a sign of the times are changing.
All right.
Okay, let's not sound so old, when we start
okay.
talking like this.
Yeah, I'm probably still a little too young to start sounding so.
Right. So,
We are 3 generation here, so it's good perspective. Everyone have different kind of view.
If 3 generations can communicate well in a middle language, across borders and cultural differences like English, I think that speaks a lot to what a great thing language has been for the advancement of humanity socially, technologically, in so many ways.
I agree. I concur, as they say in the legal.
There's a good word, concur.
Right. Concur in the legal fields, yes.
Yeah. Oh, legal language, gotta love it.
That's another language, but that's another story. Okay,
Last question for you, Atzmon. You mentioned poems and lyrics and music. I want to ask you, how does melodies and lyrics in a language influence the way you feel or the way you connect with other people like Andrew that comes from other nation?
Got lyrics and language. I think that
in terms of music. In music, yeah.
First of all, I love music, and yesterday I was at I met new people I'd never met before, and the atmosphere was so, and I started singing, and this broke the ice. So music is an icebreaker. There's no doubt about that, and it speaks to any human being, I think, feeling wise. But with Andrew, I had a very fantastic connection from the first instance. I think the ability to understand each other, to speak on a certain level, and to enjoy the discussion is a very good opening. So, and this is because of language. Language barriers are terrible. When 2 people meet and they have so much to say to each other, and they cannot speak a common language, is most frustrating. It's a terrible thing. And I'm only thinking about the inventors of language. The people, they say language, people started to speak some 70,000 years ago. And I can just think of those miserable people that had to live without a language.
Yeah.
Had to commute, and we take it for granted, but we are so blessed that 70,000 years ago, people started talking. What would we do without languages?
Well, sometimes I wish people would stop talking, but
Of course.
but yes, your point is definitely well taken. And something I think that we connected over during our first conversation is we could share a lot of those old stories and metaphors from the Hebrew language, just talking about some of those, some of the background there. I had the privilege of studying, various pieces of ancient literature and spent quite a lot of time in the Hebrew Bible. So talk about, Bereshit bara Elohim, or we can talk about the Tower of Babel, or any number of things. So that bridges a gap for us.
Yes, we were talking. I looked up, talking. We were talking about Tower of Babylon or Babel,
Yeah.
and most of the interpreters and myself too, when I reread it after
Yeah,
we'd
yeah.
spoken, are concerned with the question: why actually did God decide to punish these people?
That's my question.
What wrong did they do?
Yeah.
Omri, I think we should leave that to the next conversation
Yeah,
because
we
have
could
to.
definitely have another
because
conversation. Yeah,
Andrew has already said that maybe
he opened a
something
gate to other
would stop
subject. Yeah,
talking.
yeah.
Yes.
So, gentlemen, I really appreciate your time and thanks for being part of this incredible episode
Thank
of
you.
Exploring Life's Highway. I'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Pleasure to be here and to hear
Yeah.
such
Bye-bye.
Appreciate that. Bye bye.
Good.